I'm Daniel Mack, the Associate Dean for Collection Strategies and Services here at the University of Maryland Libraries. And I would like to welcome you all to our fall talk in the Future of the Research Library lecture series. And our speaker today is Brian Lavoie, Research Scientist at OCLC Research. Brian joined OCLC Research in 1996. He's worked on projects in many areas, including digital preservation, cooperative print management, a topic near and dear to many of our hearts, right, Cynthia? Data mining of bibliographic resources, and other topics. He was a co-founder of the working group that developed the Premise Data Dictionary for Preservation Metadata, and served as co-chair of a United States National Science Foundation Blue Ribbon Task Force on Economically Sustainable Digital Preservation. Brian's academic background is in economics. He has a PhD in agricultural economics. We're looking for an agriculture library. Brian's current research interests include stewardship of the evolving scholarly record, analysis of collective collections, and the system-wide organization of library resources. These are all topics that all of us throughout the library are very interested in these days. So this is a very timely talk, and Brian is going to focus on highlights from the recent OCLC research reports, the evolving scholarly record, and the stewardship of the evolving scholarly record from the invisible hand to conscious coordination. So please join me in welcoming Brian Lavoie.
Do I need the microphone? Can you hear me okay? Okay, because then I can wander around a little bit. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. It's very nice to be here. I was saying to my wife before I left that this is actually the first time in over 25 years that I've been on the campus of Maryland. When I was in college, I had an internship in Washington at the International Trade Commission, and I stayed the summer on campus. I worked in Washington and lived on campus here in College Park. Now this was the very late 80s, so it would have been before the Green Line. So instead of hopping on the Green Line and going to DC, I would take the bus up Route 1 to Rhode Island Avenue Metro Station, and to Gallery Place and North Park Plaza. So it was very exciting to do every morning. Then, of course, as soon as I left, they built the Green Line. I thought as a sort of an icebreaker that I might start by sharing some data about University of Maryland's library collection. So I work for OCLC, so naturally I'll talk about Maryland's collections in the context of how they're represented in WorldCat, which is OCLC's bibliographic database, and it's the largest aggregation of library metadata in the world. So here's some basic data about Maryland's collections. So again, at least as they're represented in WorldCat, more than 3.3 million total holdings across the Maryland library system. Those holdings set on more than 3.3 million distinct publications, so those would include materials of all descriptions. So that's a pretty sizable footprint in WorldCat. The number of publications slightly less than the number of total holdings because presumably some units or some materials would be held by multiple units within the Maryland system. So over on the right, the orange boxes there, this gives you a sense of the global diversity of Maryland's collections. More than 300 different languages represented in the publications you hold. About 20% of those publications are published in languages other than English. Maryland's collections are drawn from publications from more than 200 different countries around the world. Almost 40% of the collection comes from countries outside the U.S. And for the part of Maryland's collection that does come from the U.S., was published in the U.S., you have publications from every state in the Union. At the bottom, there's some data tells us that Maryland, over the years, has contributed nearly 200,000 records of original cataloging to WorldCat. And then more than 600,000 holdings have been set on those records. So that says that on average, for every record that Maryland contributes, there's about 3 holdings set on those records. Now, assuming Maryland is one of those holdings, that means that on average, for every record that Maryland contributes, at least 2 other libraries benefit from that contribution. So that suggests a very significant contribution, not just to WorldCat, but to the library community as a whole. And here we use some WorldCat data to get a sense of some of Maryland's distinctive strengths in the context of the sort of the system-wide library community. So what we have here are subject areas or topics where Maryland holds more publications than any other library in WorldCat. So what do we have? We have historic buildings, we have Asriel Rosenfeld, biometric identification, piano sonatas, materials about the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and materials about the National Association of Broadcasters. I think this is really interesting because you can really see how these library collections complement and play to the strengths, the broader strengths of the university as a whole. So for historic buildings, for example, Maryland has a master's program in historic preservation in the School of Architecture. Piano sonatas. Maryland has a very well-known school of music. How many people know who Asriel Rosenfeld is? Nobody. Well, he's a leading computer scientist who spent his career here at Maryland. And biometric identification, Maryland's, I think it's the Laboratory for Physical Sciences, they have a research group that focuses on biometrics. So I think this is a really excellent example of how library collections can grow to support the broader university strengths and priorities, but then at the same time become distinctive resources in the library system as a whole. Okay, on to more weightier matters. So I want to start by just sharing this picture, which I think is a nice way of sort of introducing the topic that I'm going to discuss today. So this is from the recently published New Media Consortium Horizon Report on Academic Libraries, which is a report that comes out every year, and it talks about some of the key trends, challenges, technologies that are impacting academic libraries today. And it's hard to digest this picture at a glance, but what it's saying is that the evolving nature of the scholarly record is one of 2 key trends that's going to impact technology adoption in academic libraries in the sort of the next 3 to 5 year time frame. And it seems to me that suggests that it's worthwhile to unpack that trend a bit and understand its implications for academic libraries as they continue to pursue their traditional mission of gathering, curating, and making available the scholarly record. So that's what we're going to do in the talk today. This is a territory I'll cover. I'll start by talking about some background, some trends that are shaping the scholarly record today. And then I want to drill down into that and talk about the evolving scholarly record from 3 different perspectives. The scope of the scholarly record, the key stakeholder roles attached to the scholarly record, stewardship of the scholarly record. So 3 important ways of thinking of the scholarly record. And then I'd like to take that discussion and focus it on some key issues which I think are of a special interest to academic libraries. And then at the end we'll have time for discussion and questions. Okay, so let's spend some time thinking about what the evolving scholarly record is and try to map out that landscape a little bit. And I'll start with this, which is I think, emblematic of some of the trends that are shaping the scholarly record today. So this is OU Create. It's a service that's run by the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Oklahoma. And what it does is it provides services to faculty and students to help them build and maintain a digital identity, both for themselves and for their scholarship. So if you go to the website, it says that OU Create aims to empower all members of the OU community to craft and control their digital narrative through the use of blogs, portfolios, wikis, and more. And I think that this really captures the essence of how the scholarly record is changing today. You see here, the emphasis, the shift in focus on digital scholarly outputs. The adaptation of new channels of scholarly communication, and also the emergence of a notion of a digital identity that extends over a really wide range of scholarly outputs. If you look at the upper left-hand corner there, the goals for this program, I think, are also quite instructive. I can barely read them. Empowering digital scholarship, expanding digital literacy, creating digital citizens. These are becoming fundamental services for supporting research and learning in today's environment. So let's move from the particular to the general, talk about some of the general trends that are impacting the scholarly record today. So I've listed some on the slides here. The first one is no surprise to anyone. We're witnessing this massive shift in format from what was traditionally a print-centric scholarly record to one that's increasingly digital and networked in form. The boundaries of the scholarly record are extending. Again, traditionally, we might think of the scholarly record as, journal articles, scholarly monographs. Those are still a very important part of the scholarly record, but now they're being joined by a wider range of other scholarly outputs, things like data sets, computer models, electronic lab notebooks, interactive programs, complex visualizations, and a host of other materials. I think some of the fundamental characteristics of the scholarly record are changing. Again, traditionally, when we think of the scholarly record, that the scholarly outputs that went into the scholarly record were mostly static. Once they were published, they didn't change very much by virtue of the fact that almost all of them were published in print. What entered the scholarly record did so through formal publication channels. And I would argue that most of what went into the scholarly record was outcome focused. It focused on the results of scholarly inquiry and not so much on the context surrounding the production and aftermath of those results. Today, I think all of those characteristics are being turned on their head. The scholarly record is much more dynamic, again, because scholarly outputs are now becoming digital in form and they can change, they can be more fluid. Stuff is entering the scholarly record through a blend of both formal and informal publication channels. And I think there's much more focus today on documenting the complete research cycle as part of the scholarly record. And there's a wide variety of reasons for that, but two that I think are particularly important. In many disciplines, there's sort of a renewed focus on replicability. There's been some recent publications, I think, in psychology studies where they were having trouble replicating the results. There was a recent paper in economics that they were having trouble replicating some published results. So I think that gathering together the materials necessary to actually reproduce, replicate published results is becoming more important in disciplines where previously that wasn't so. And then leverageability, for want of a better word, this is the idea that I think there's higher expectations about being able to take published work and seamlessly integrate it into new work, whether it's to corroborate earlier results or to build on those results in new lines of inquiry. And then stakeholders reconfiguring, by this we mean that the pathways by which scholarly materials are created and consumed are changing. And the configurations of stakeholders associated with those materials are changing, where you have some stakeholders that are taking on new roles, new responsibilities, and you have other stakeholders that are dropping out of the picture entirely. And we'll talk about that a bit more a little later. So understanding the nature, the scope, the evolutionary trends of the scholarly record is an important issue in many quarters. Obviously for libraries, also for publishers, for funders, and even for individual scholars themselves. Myself and some colleagues in OCLC Research decided that it would be useful to try to develop a framework to help organize and support discussions about the evolving scholarly record. And we would do this by providing sort of a big picture view of the scholarly record that includes an enumeration of the key categories of material that the scholarly record is stretching to encompass, and then also the key stakeholder roles that are associated with the scholarly record. In producing this framework, we hope that it would be useful as a common reference point for discussions about issues pertaining to the scholarly record that occur within domains, but then perhaps even more importantly, those kinds of discussions that have to occur across domains. And we also felt it would be a useful resource to support strategic planning for a variety of organizations, including libraries, of course. This was published last year, and it's available on the OCLC Research website. What I want to do now is just spend some time going over some of the highlights from this framework and give you a sense of our view of how the scholarly record is evolving in today's environment. So we can start here with this picture, which is a representation of how we framed out the scope of the scholarly record as it's evolving today. And we can start in the middle with the blue rectangle, which represents sort of final published outcomes. So this is the the reporting of final results, final conclusions, final ideas from scholarly research. These published outcomes are still sort of the coin of the realm for scholarly communication even today, so that's why we privilege them here at the center of the picture. A lot of these published outcomes take the familiar form of materials like journal articles, monographs, and so forth, the familiar text-based materials that we've been managing for quite some time. But they're increasingly supplemented by other materials such as video, graphics, interactive programs, and so forth. Now, the rest of the scholarly record is divided into two broad areas: process and aftermath. So let's deal with process first, which is the upper half of the picture. So by process, we mean the process of scholarly communication. The process of scholarly activity. The activities leading up to the production of those results that are reported in the final outcomes in the center of the picture. So what we did was we identified three key categories of materials that are generated during that process phase of scholarly work, in which there's now a growing interest in capturing them and making them part of the scholarly record. So the first category there is method. So these are materials related to the methodology of scholarly work. Things like software, computer models, survey instruments, experimental protocols, instrument calibrations, and so on. Evidence. The raw materials that go into a particular research project, the inputs, if you will. So, for example, data sets, that would be an obvious example there, survey results, new or enhanced primary source documents, even links to findings from other scholarly works. All of that would be relevant there. And then discussion. So this is the idea that those final results, they don't just pop out of the scholar's head fully fledged, but they often go through some sort of formative process where they're refined and improved by interactions with other scholars, discussions with other scholars. And these discussions can generate materials that we might want to include as part of the scholarly record. And indeed, some people are included as part of the scholarly record. So things like preprints, listserv, and blog discussions, conference presentations, even things like grant proposals and reviews of grant proposals would be relevant there. So the main idea is that by anchoring those final outcomes in the center of the picture to the methods employed, the evidence used, and the formative discussions that take place during the process of scholarly inquiry, we get a deeper contextual understanding of those published outcomes in the center of the picture, which in turn, of course, facilitates replicability, leverageability, and so on. Now, once something has been published, scholarly activity around that piece of work can continue in what we call the aftermath phase of scholarly activity. And just as we did in the process phase, we identified three key categories of materials that, again, there's a growing interest in capturing them and making them part of the scholarly record. So the first category, we have another discussion category. So this covers all the different kinds of post-publication discussions that are out there. Many of those discussions would take place through similar channels to what we enumerated for discussion in the process phase, but also things like formal post-publication reviews and commentaries. Revision. This is the idea that once something has been published, it can be revised in various ways. It can be enhanced with additional findings. Errors can be corrected. Clarifications can be made. Again, all of that generating materials that might be incorporated into the scholarly record. And then lastly, reuse. So here we mean, once something's been published, it can be edited or repackaged for different audiences, for different venues. So for example, conference presentations, summaries, blog posts, versions of scholarly work that are intended for a popular audience, and so on. So a couple of points about this picture. We're not suggesting that all of these materials will enter the scholarly record in every discipline. In fact, that will vary from discipline to discipline, from context to context. So I think it's better to view this picture as sort of a maximal view of the scope and depth of the scholarly record, and a representation of the range of materials in which there's now interest in various quarters in terms of capturing these materials, curating them, and making them permanently accessible. The other point I wanted to make about this picture is there's a dynamic element in this that isn't really apparent from the picture. So what I mean there is materials that we might initially categorize in one of the outlying components might over time actually migrate to the center and become sort of published outcomes in their own right. And I think data sets are a great example of that. So in some disciplines, even today, the publication of an important data set is considered a first-class scientific contribution on a par with a more traditional journal article. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that as scholarly practice changes, where we pigeonhole the various materials in this picture will be a bit fluid, and things that we might consider ancillary materials today might become full-fledged scholarly contributions, scholarly outcomes in future years. Now I realize this picture is a bit abstract, so I wanted to make it more concrete by offering you a few examples of materials that even today are starting to enter the scholarly record from all of these categories. So starting in the upper half of the picture, the process phase, the method category, Methods X is a journal that was launched by Elsevier not long ago, which allows researchers to publish methodological innovations they've come up with that they think would be of interest to other researchers. If you go to their website, they have this really great tagline of releasing the hidden gems from your lab notebook. Evidence, a couple of examples there, data repositories and data journals. Dryad is a data repository that curates data sets associated with the published literature in the life sciences. The Geoscience Data Journal is published by Wiley, and it's a platform for formally publishing data sets through a peer review process similar to what you would go through with a traditional journal article. Discussion in the process phase, a couple of examples there. Archive, you're probably familiar with, it's been around for quite some time. It's a preprint repository that allows you to expose your work to colleagues, to other scholars, for commentary and discussion prior to formal publication. The Journal of Brief Ideas, I think this is quite interesting. It's a journal where you can publish ideas, citable ideas in 200 words or less, which sounds a bit tongue-in-cheek, but what it is the rationale for it is that you can basically stake a claim to an idea before it's fully fleshed out into a full-fledged research project. The reason I put it under discussion is that one of the reasons the journal gives for publishing your idea is that you can receive early-stage feedback on it, which allows you to refine and improve it. And if you go to the website for this journal, you can actually vote on the ideas and comment on them. So it's an interesting way of discussing research prior to formal publication. Shifting down to the aftermath phase, discussion again. Club Peer is a service you may have heard of. It allows you to discuss, it's a venue for discussing published articles, so sort of a post-publication discussion channel. If you go to the website for Club Peer, they say that the reason they came up with this service was from a perceived lack of venues for post-publication discussion on journal websites. And Why Nations Fail is a blog, actually, that was launched simultaneously with a book by the same title that was written by a couple of economists. And what this is an opportunity for the authors to launch and sustain a discussion about the ideas that they present in their book with interested colleagues and other scholars, and to apply those ideas to current events as opportunity arises. So you see more and more of these kinds of book blogs appearing as part of the publication process. Revision of Figshare is a service which allows you to upload ancillary materials for your published work and make them citable and consistently accessible. Involving manuscripts, I think another really interesting idea. This is actually more vision than reality, but I mention it because it's like revision to the extreme. So this is something that was dreamed up by Mark Wolpert, who's the chief scientific advisor in the UK. And his idea is that the results from a particular research program would enter the scholarly record through an evolving manuscript that would be updated as the research progresses. So basically, these results would enter the scholarly record through a continuous stream of updates and enhancements to a single scholarly document, rather than through the publication of a series of discrete publications, articles, monographs, and so forth. So I think that's a very interesting idea. And then for reuse, a couple of examples there for conference presentations, which are a common way of repurposing published work. SlideShare, I'm sure you're familiar with, a web-based service for exposing presentations. F1000 Posters is a permanent repository for conference posters and presentations. Both of these services allow you to make your presentations discoverable, citable, and persistently accessible. There's many other examples we could populate this picture with as well. Now, before we leave this topic, I wanted to point out one more example, which I think is interesting just because of the sheer scope of its ambition. So the Research Ideas and Outcomes Journal, or RIO, is a new journal which publishes every single output you can think of from the research cycle. Anything ranging from project proposals, to data sets, to methods, to the final article itself. So basically, it covers virtually everything we represented in our scholarly record picture that we looked at a few minutes ago. It's published by a Bulgarian academic publisher called Pensoft. It's open access. It has a peer review process. It claims to cover all our areas of academic interest. So, as you can see, their ambition is quite ambitious. It's been written up in a couple of prestigious places, Nature and Science, as you see on the slide there. Now, I don't know if a journal like this is really viable. I think that's certainly to be seen. But I really think it's emblematic of the changes that we're seeing in the scholarly record today, where we're going out, we're capturing, we're publishing, we're making accessible, citable, and preserving the full range of scholarly outputs that are generated during the entire process of scholarly activity and its aftermath. What's that it says on the website, or there at the top, science at its fullest. So this is like the scholarly record at its fullest. So let's look at how we view the scholarly record evolving today. That's the kind of scholarly record that we're going to be dealing with going forward. Let's switch gears now and talk about the ecosystem of stakeholders that surrounds that scholarly record. And when I do that, we talk about this, I don't want to just focus on specific entities like library, publisher, funder, because the nature of those entities, their identity of them is going to change from context to context. So just as we did with the scholarly record itself, let's move up a couple of layers of abstraction and instead characterize this ecosystem as a set of very broadly defined stakeholder roles that are fulfilled in the process of serving or supporting the scholarly record. And I want to emphasize that these are roles, not distinct entities, because in practice, multiple roles could be subsumed within one entity. But anyway, let's take a closer look and we'll see what I mean. So start on the right there with create. So this is the role filled by authors and other agents who create materials that will potentially enter the scholarly record. Moving counterclockwise around the circle, we get to fix. So this is, by fix we don't mean repair, but we mean fix materials in the literature in some way. So this is a role that's traditionally filled by publishers and other organizations that take the materials created by authors and transition them into an authoritative, possibly peer-reviewed version that's accessible, citable, and persistently available. And they often do that through some sort of established publication venue, like a journal. Collect is the role filled by libraries and other institutions that collect the materials that are fixed in the literature. They collect them, they organize them, and they prepare them for long-term use and preservation. And then lastly, use, of course. People use the scholarly record for a multiplicity of purposes, and in doing so, they often create new materials that will enter the scholarly record, and the cycle sort of starts again. Now, I certainly would acknowledge up front that there's a lot of nuance buried underneath these very broadly defined roles. And I would also acknowledge that the distinction between these roles is not nearly as precise as the picture seems to suggest. But again, the idea here was to come up with a conceptualization of the stakeholder ecosystem that could be used to support thinking about how these stakeholder roles are being configured and reconfigured in the parallel with the evolution of the scholarly record itself. So let me show you a couple of examples of what I mean. So we think about the traditional print-centric scholarly record. I think these roles were essentially configured in this way. A very simple model. Stuff was created. It was sent to publishers who published it. Libraries collected that published literature, made it available for long-term use. Stuff got used. More stuff created, and we start around the cycle again. And I think that this configuration of roles is still quite relevant for many portions of the scholarly record today. But I also think that in some quarters of the scholarly record, these configurations are changing in important ways. And I think a great example of that that's actually been around for quite some time is the e-literature, the e-journal literature. And the big change here is I think that the traditional collect role has been disintermediated from the ecosystem. So if you think about the e-journal literature, this stuff remains in the custody of publishers. It's accessed through the publisher's web platforms. The library, which traditionally took custody of these materials and performed what we would think of as the traditional collect role, has seen its role diminished in this regard to acting more as a broker, facilitating access to these materials on behalf of its constituent faculty and students. Now, interestingly enough, though, as time goes on and this configuration continues to evolve, we see efforts to sort of reintegrate the collect role back into the configuration. Think about the emergence of organizations like JSTOR or Portico, which are organizations that have gone out and obtained custody of portions of the e-journal literature and have committed to maintaining long-term access to them. But again, there's some change there. So the collect role is back in the picture. It's not really libraries that are handling that function. It's a different set of stakeholders, a different set of sort of third-party organizations that have emerged to fulfill that role. Another example, think about the portions of the scholarly record that are manifested in various social media channels. here I would argue that both the traditional fix and collect roles have been disintermediated from the configuration. Well, a lot of these materials are made available directly from their creators to their users, albeit through some sort of intermediary system, which is often proprietary, and might perform some of the functions that we would typically associate with the fix and collect roles, but certainly not all of them. But again, as time has gone on, things continue to evolve, and we've seen some organizations try to resurrect the more traditional fix and collect roles in relation to these materials. So I think a great example of that is the Twitter archive, which was placed in the custody of the Library of Congress for long-term curation and research use. Also, think about various efforts to collect and curate academic blogs would be another example. So I think the big idea, the big point to take away from this is that these traditional roles, stakeholder roles that we sort of inherited from the Printcentric scholarly record, create, fix, collect, use, they're still with us today. They're still very important. But the new kinds of scholarly communication, the new kinds of scholarly outputs that we're witnessing today have in some cases disrupted the tight linkage that we traditionally had between those roles and really sort of disrupted the stakeholder configurations that sit underneath them. So you have traditional stakeholders, like libraries and other organizations that are perhaps taking on new responsibilities in regard to some of these materials within the context of these roles, or might be dropping out of the ecosystem entirely. And you also have new stakeholders entering the system as well. So there's lots of dynamics, lots of changes in terms of how these roles are actually manifested and carried out in today's environment. Okay, so we've looked at the scope of the scholarly record. We've said a few words about the stakeholders, the key stakeholders that are associated with the scholarly record, the production and management of the scholarly record. Let's now switch gears and talk about stewardship of the scholarly record. So we recently published a new report, Stewardship of the Evolving Scholarly Record, which basically takes the ideas from the first report and extends them to thinking about the stewardship implications for a scholarly record like the one that we've just been discussing. So the basic idea is that stewardship arrangements, stewardship models for the scholarly record are evolving in parallel with the evolution of the scholarly record itself. So in this report, we introduced the concept of what we call conscious coordination, which we think is going to be the sort of driving principle behind the organization of stewardship arrangements going forward. So we talk about what we mean by conscious coordination. We contrast it to traditional approaches to stewardship, and we talk about some of the practical implications of building and sustaining consciously coordinated stewardship efforts. So let's take a few minutes and look at some of these ideas. And we can start by thinking about what I'll just call traditional stewardship models, and in particular stewardship models for a print-centric scholarly record. We argue in the report that stewardship of the print-centric scholarly record was essentially a byproduct, if you will, of an uncoordinated, highly distributed, and to some extent highly duplicative process of managing local print collections. So the idea here is that the stewardship of the overall scholarly record, not just what's in one library's collection, but the entire scholarly record writ large, was not the result of anyone intentionally going out and trying to achieve that, but rather it was achieved sort of unconsciously through the aggregation of a lot of local, internally directed stewardship efforts aimed at, preserving local print collections. And what you ended up with then, as a result, was an aggregate library resource, the collective collection of academic libraries, that was a pretty good representation of the scholarly record, at least in the sense of a scholarly record that was primarily print formally published materials. We use the metaphor of the invisible hand to describe this approach to stewardship. If you remember from your Economics 101, Adam Smith said that private individuals acting in their own interest are led as if by an invisible hand to a socially beneficial outcome. And I think you see that process at work here with traditional approaches to stewardship. Individual institutions, in the course of pursuing their own local stewardship efforts aimed at preserving their own local collections, were led collectively as if by an invisible hand to a socially beneficial outcome, which in this case was stewardship of the overall scholarly record. Now, we argue in the report that this invisible hand approach to stewardship is no longer adequate for a digital networked scholarly record that's expanding in its scope and expanding in its distribution. And the reason for this is that the evolving scholarly record is actually part of a broader trend involving a fundamental transformation of academic library collections. And you can see that with this picture here, which my colleague Lorcan Dempsey has been using in some of his recent talks. So let's start on the left there with what Lorcan calls the owned collection. So this is a very traditional view of the library collection, where libraries go out, they purchase stuff, they bring it back to the library, and the stuff is used, it's accessed within the library's physical space. So very, very traditional, almost stereotypical view of libraries. Now, obviously, over the years, library collections have evolved significantly from that sort of endpoint. So as we move along the continuum toward the right, we see a bunch of fundamental transformations that have occurred over time. We see the emergence of the borrowed collection. So, the emergence of sophisticated resource sharing networks that complement and support local collections. We've seen the emergence of licensed collections, where instead of getting physical custody of materials, libraries instead license access to those materials on behalf of their faculty and students, but the material resides and is managed elsewhere. We've seen the emergence of shared print activities, where instead of managing print materials locally, institutions have found benefits from moving those print management activities above the institution into some kind of shared stewardship arrangement. And now we see the emergence of the evolving scholarly record that we've been talking about, where you have this wide variety of scholarly outputs, this really diverse and technically complex sometimes, digital scholarly outputs that are poised to enter the scholarly record. And one of the key characteristics of those materials is they have a very highly distributed pattern of custodial responsibility. In other words, they're scattered all over the network in many different hands. And I think the key implication there is that many of these materials, and I would hazard to say most of these materials, are actually not in academic library collections. And that leads you to an important corollary, where you could say that today, and this will become more true as going forward, the scholarly record is no longer approximated in the collective resource of academic library collections. You can't say that, looking over the collective holdings of academic libraries everywhere, you've captured the scholarly record in its fullest expression. Libraries are simply not collecting, and indeed they lack the resources to collect the full range of scholarly outputs that are emerging today. So what we're doing is we're moving along that continuum toward the endpoint on the right-hand side, which is what Lorcan calls the facilitated collection. And what we mean there is that we're in a position, a transition to a point where providing local access to the scholarly record is no longer about building large, representative local collections, but instead providing local access to the scholarly record is about facilitating access to a wide range of scholarly outputs that are scattered, as I say, scattered all over the network and reside in many different hands. And how this all relates to stewardship is that in this transition from the owned collection to the facilitated collection, you're going to see a parallel shift in stewardship models from invisible hand strategies for stewardship, which I think is more suited toward collections that are more that are sort of located on the left-hand side of the continuum. A shift away from invisible hand strategies towards something we call conscious coordination, which is a stewardship approach that's more in keeping with this idea of a facilitated collection in today's environment. So what do we mean by conscious coordination? Well, in the report, we say that consciously coordinated stewardship involves 4 key principles, which we've listed here on the slide. So the first one is system-wide awareness. This is the idea that local stewardship efforts take place in the context of a broader awareness of system-wide stewardship efforts. You know, which institutions are collecting what? What commitments have been made around portions of the scholarly record at other places? And how does the local collection, how does the local stewardship effort fit into the broader, collective system-wide stewardship effort? Explicit commitments. We see the emergence of explicit stewardship commitments around portions of the local collection where institutions accept and undertake to fulfill responsibilities for collecting and making available certain types of materials. Now, the key idea there, though, is those commitments are not just commitments to local faculty and students, but they're a commitment to a broader external community of stakeholders. Division of labor. We expect to see the emergence of sort of formal divisions of labor within cooperative arrangements. So what we mean there is, rather than trying to collect some of everything, you'll see more of a focus on specialization in collection building. Institutions will try to collect more of less, if you will. They'll invest more intensively in a narrower range of materials within the context of cooperative arrangements where other institutions are collecting and making available other parts of the scholarly record. And then reciprocal access. If you have a stewardship strategy that's characterized, or a collection strategy, characterized by increased specialization, you have to support that by implementing really robust resource sharing networks that will ensure that every institution has ready access to all parts of the scholarly record. In other words, there has to be a mutual assurance that the materials collected by one institution will be easily available to other partners and vice versa. So we discussed these principles in more detail in the report, but the basic idea is that we expect stewardship arrangements for the evolving scholarly record to adopt these principles in one form or another. And again, to make this a bit more concrete, let me offer you some examples of where we're starting to see these principles sort of manifest themselves in stewardship arrangements even today, or stewardship-related services. So for system-wide awareness, think about HathiTrust. HathiTrust takes great pains to measure the overlap between its members' print collections and the holdings in the Hathi Shared Digital Repository. Sustainable Collection Services, SCS, which was recently acquired by OCLC. SCS allows you to compare local print holdings to print holdings in the global library system, at least as they're represented in WorldCount. Both of these services place the local collection in a broader system-wide context, and in doing so, facilitates decision-making around local collections, whether it's as part of some cooperative arrangement, or if it's just local decision-making that's made in the context of what's going on elsewhere, even if there is no formal cooperation. Explicit commitments, the Mark 583 field, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a way to record preservation commitments in group catalogs to support cooperative collection management strategies. Another example, the UK Research Reserve. So this is a registry of retained print holdings in the UK that institutions can use to inform their own local print retention decisions based on the commitments that are articulated in that registry. Division of labor. So again, we see this with a growing importance for of specialization in collection building strategies. Now, certainly special collections have always been part of the research library landscape. I don't want to suggest otherwise. But I think what we're talking about here is that this kind of specialization is starting to become a fundamental strategy for many institutions. Just a couple of examples to give you a flavor. Think about Columbia University Library's Contemporary Web Composers Archive, which is a very unique resource that Columbia has collected, and it isn't duplicated anywhere else in the library system. And Dryad is another good example, I think. We talked about Dryad earlier. It's a data repository that specializes in curating data sets related to the published literature in the life sciences. That's all they do. That's the niche of the scholarly record that they serve. And we see more and more of that kind of specialization emerging in the context of stewarding the scholarly record. Reciprocal access, you see this with efforts to reduce frictions in sort of established resource sharing networks like Borrow Direct or UBorrow. And you also see the new initiatives like Share, which is an effort designed to improve the discoverability and accessibility of a wide variety of digital scholarly outputs that are scattered all over the network in many different places. So I think that these examples show that these elements of conscious coordination that we mentioned here are starting to creep into stewardship strategies today for both traditional scholarly outputs and also for various emerging forms of scholarly outputs. And I think that as we go forward, we're going to see more and more of this as stewardship models are recalibrated in the context of an evolving scholarly record. Okay, so the last section of my talk, I want to take this discussion and sort of really focus it on academic libraries. And there's lots of issues we could talk about here. I mean, for time constraints, I'm going to focus on these three issues, which I think are of particular interest to academic libraries. And we touched on them in one form or another earlier in the talk. But first one, the fact that much of the scholarly record as it's constituted today is not represented in local academic library collections. Secondly, that the basis for providing access to local access to the scholarly record involves a shift from owned collections to facilitated collections that I talked about earlier. And third, the fact that local collections and services are increasingly embedded in networks of collective access and stewardship responsibility. So what I want to do is just talk about each of these a little bit, say a few words about each of them. I want to pose a couple of questions for each of them that I think it's useful to think about in an academic library setting. And then I'll also, for each, I'll have a couple of examples just by way of illustration. Okay. So the first issue, the idea that the scholarly record is imperfectly represented in academic library collections, and it's not just the fact that an individual library collection is less representative of the full range of scholarly outputs that are out there today. It's the fact that the academic library collections collectively are less representative. As I said, there's just certain materials out there that academic libraries don't and can't collect and make available. And this is an important concern if you're thinking about long-term stewardship. Now, one of the reasons for this state of affairs is that you see new modes of digital research and scholarship emerging that take place in an ecosystem that's really quite separate from the traditional library supply chain. So students and faculty discover, they consume, they create digital scholarly outputs in environments that have little or nothing to do with the library itself, like Figshare, ResearchGate, Mendeley, and others. Some of those platforms offer services to libraries, but many of them don't. So when we think about that, the library's role in terms of stewardship responsibility to the scholarly record, I think the fundamental question to ask is whether your institution feels a preservation responsibility to the wide variety of scholarly outputs that are created during what we call the process and aftermath phases of scholarly work. How can those materials be collected and managed alongside the more traditional published outcomes that libraries have traditionally collected? And if your library does feel a preservation responsibility, then it's important to think about what's the library expertise that is going to be the really unique contribution to appraising and selecting these materials, and how can workflows for that kind of operation be complement and be laid alongside the more traditional workflows for purchased and licensed materials. So should the library be more involved in collecting these new kinds of scholarly outputs? And if so, what's the library's real expertise? What can we contribute toward making sure those materials stay accessible over the long term? A couple of examples of material or venues where scholarly materials are sort of coalescing outside the library's traditional sphere. GitHub, some of you might be familiar with, it's a code repository. It's used by software developers, but it's also used by researchers to deposit and share the code that they produce as part of their research. Actually, students of computer science also use GitHub to manage the code that they produce for their course projects. It's interesting, in the example on the screen, this is an undergraduate from Rutgers who's using GitHub to not only manage their code, but also their class notes from computer science, mathematics, and philosophy courses. Figshare we talked about a little earlier. So this is a service that allows you to publish, make accessible a wider variety of scholarly outputs than would traditionally be made available through established publication venues. So like GitHub, faculty and students use this service to make this array of materials accessible, citable, and persistently accessible. Librarians use it too. So in the example here, this librarian from Carnegie Mellon is using Figshare to publish a conference poster that they were involved in. And then we also need to think about services like ResearchGate and Mendeley, which, among other things, encourage authors, scholars to deposit open access versions of their work into their shared repository. So what these services potentially represent, are essentially shop windows of content that can be organized either by individual scholars or by an institution, which is, as you see in the example there, the University of Michigan. These services offer an array of discovery, access, and storage services, and they often have various researcher-focused social networking services built on top of them as well. So the point is that you see these sort of conglomerations of scholarly outputs coalescing in these various places outside of the library sphere. But how many of these materials are actually going to survive over the long term? And what can the library do to ensure that the most important of these materials do in fact become part of the permanent scholarly record, not just the scholarly record of today. Another issue, this transition to facilitated collections that we talked about in the context of an evolving scholarly record, which is increasingly scattered over the network in many hands. This creates some interesting issues involving institutional responsibility to the scholarly record. And you see this in a variety of different ways. Demand-driven acquisition. Think about the various just-in-time fulfillment services that academic libraries are using today. Should an institution feel a preservation responsibility to the entire selection pool of materials in those services, or just the materials that it ultimately purchases? Think about article fulfillment services, article-level fulfillment services. Institutions that use those services, do they have some sort of preservation obligation to the journal as well as the article, even though the unit that they're acquiring is just the article? Think about open access resources. A lot of academic libraries and their discovery environments include various kinds of open access resources, make them discoverable to faculty and students. But they're just pointing at those resources. They're not managing them in the traditional sense. So what's the institutional responsibility to materials that we're making accessible or discoverable to scholars, but that we actually have no hand in curating and ensuring they persist over the long term? An institutional repository is another interesting example here. We're sort of in this transition phase now with institutional repositories where you see many institutions moving away from a model where they're aggregating content in their institutional repositories. And instead, many institutions are aggregating metadata, and then they're pointing to content that resides elsewhere, outside the institution. So what's the library's, what's the institution's preservation responsibility to that content? That it resides in many repositories outside the institution. So you're building this institutional bibliography, but you're not actually controlling, curating, managing the materials in that bibliography. And that can be a very significant issue because many of those materials are very important for an institution's identity and research reputation. So a couple of questions to consider here as well. Do you feel fully informed about how your faculty and students are using these extra institutional content repositories where these important scholarly outputs are starting to coalesce? Do you have any intra-institutional partnerships with other campus units that also have an interest in monitoring how faculty and students are managing their research outputs, where they're putting them, and what their chances for long-term sustainability are? A couple of examples here for open access content, which I think are interesting. So the top one there, HathiTrust. So many institutions set holdings on the books in the HathiTrust digital archive and make them discoverable in their OPACs without being members of HathiTrust themselves. Now that's perfectly fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, HathiTrust actually encourages that to some extent because, for example, the Hathi's public domain archive is considered a contribution to the public good. But it does raise an important question because now these libraries that claim to hold these digitized books in their collections are pointing to them. They're not actually contributing toward their long-term preservation. So there's this divide opening up between the materials that a library is making discoverable and the materials that a library is actually in a position to curate or preserve. And then also open access journals. Many libraries are set holdings on a wide variety of open access journals and make them discoverable to their faculty and students. There was a study that was done in 2010 looking at open access titles in WorldCat, and they found that some of those titles had hundreds of holdings set on them. But not all of those institutions that set those holdings, that claim to hold these titles in their collections, are doing anything to make sure that these journals are preserved. I mean, they're not participating in a locks network. They're not participating in some other kind of digital preservation effort. So what we're led to then is this idea that as you see this shift from the owned collection, where materials are in the custody of libraries, managed by libraries, to this concept of a facilitated collection where materials are not necessarily managed by the library, they're just pointed to by the library. You get this situation where discoverability on the one hand and stewardship on the other are becoming decoupled. Oh, one more example before we leave this point, because I think it's kind of interesting. So some of these open access journal titles are becoming actually quite prestigious. So if you think about PLOS and eLife. eLife is interesting because eLife is the journal, open access journal, that published the article about the discovery of the new species of early man. That was in the news a couple of months ago. If you look at WorldCat data, more than 125 libraries claim to hold eLife in their collections. Now, I think we can all agree that if you have high impact, high quality scholarship such as this, it should be a priority for preservation. But that preservation is not going to be carried out by the academic libraries that claim to hold this eLife in their collection. It's actually going to be guaranteed by PubMed Central, which is a repository managed by the NIH. So this gives you a sense, I think, of the increasingly complex networks of stewardship responsibility involving many different stakeholders that libraries are coming to depend on to ensure the discoverability and long-term preservation of the scholarly record. eLife is very open about the fact that they rely on partnerships with other organizations to ensure that their content is, quote, widely and permanently accessible. So they partner with GitHub, they partner with Mendeley, they partner with PubMed Central. I think it's quite significant that libraries are not on that list. Okay, the last issue I want to talk about. So as the eLife example shows, I think, libraries are becoming increasingly embedded and increasingly reliant on networks of collective responsibility for long-term stewardship of the scholarly record. And as we see these sort of shared stewardship arrangements appearing, there's a sort of a heightened, higher interest in thinking about governance and sustainability issues related to those shared arrangements. So, like the business model supporting Hadi Trust, or the service level agreements that support initiatives like the Western Regional Storage Trust, which is a major shared print effort. And I think this is a positive thing because it means that libraries are developing more sort of business-like relationships with those initiatives in the sense that as there's an increased reliance on them for stewardship and access, there's also, comes with that, higher expectations in terms of service and reliability. Now, on the other side of the coin, initiatives like Hadi Trust have to think very carefully about the incentives to participate or contribute to these shared stewardship arrangements. They have to develop business models, governance models that operate on those incentives in such a way that they call forth the necessary participation rates, contributions, and commitments that are needed to sustain them over the long term. And I think there's a couple of interesting questions to think about here. In regard to your own library. What is the motivation for your institution to participate in various cooperative or shared stewardship arrangements? What do you expect to gain from those arrangements? And equally important, what do you expect to contribute to them? And then also important, how do you assess the robustness of those relationships, of those initiatives? Are you confident that they're organized in such a way that they can be sustained over the long term? Now I'll finish up with these examples. And I just wanted to use these to sort of demonstrate the importance of shared stewardship, shared collections, as in many quarters in terms of a strategy for gathering and making accessible the scholarly record in today's environment. And I've illustrated it with 4 examples of newly created positions that academic libraries or related organizations have been advertising lately. So for example, with OhioLink, you see a position where they want someone to run a shared print program on a consortial scale. At Indiana University, they need someone to develop a collection strategy that explicitly acknowledges the importance of shared collections for local access to the scholarly record. The one's labeled Michigan, but it's actually Hobby Trust. They're looking for someone to develop a shared print program, archiving program, in conjunction with a shared digital repository. And then the last one there, Copal, in Canada, they're looking for someone to organize and maintain a regional digital preservation network. So all of these positions, I think, are sort of emblematic of this shift to shared stewardship models for the scholarly record, or as we talk about it in our report, consciously coordinated stewardship models. And I think that positions like this are sort of the vanguard of a bigger shift toward consciously coordinated stewardship arrangements that we'll see going forward. Okay, talked for a long time, so let me wrap it up by posing and answering this question. Now, what is the scholarly record? So, in our view, the scholarly record is a selection of scholarly content represented by that first visual reference there at the top, that places greater emphasis on collecting the scholarly outputs that are produced in the process and aftermath phases of scholarly work, and therefore creates a scholarly record that's a deeper and much more contextual representation of scholarly activity than we've ever seen before. That selection of content has to be supported by stable configurations of the stakeholder roles that we enumerated in our stakeholder ecosystem. In particular, those configurations have to be arranged in such a way that these materials are systematically gathered, curated, and made persistently available. And then all of this then needs to be sustained through stewardship arrangements characterized by the 4 principles of conscious coordination that we discussed a few minutes ago. So, scope, stakeholders, stewardship, this is our broad vision of where the scholarly record is evolving today, the direction it's evolving today. And we think that this vision is important for academic libraries as they think about how they'll need to calibrate or recalibrate their infrastructure, their coordinating capacity, their shared practices to ensure that the scholarly record continues to be sustained in its fullest expression. I think that's the end. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? No questions at all? Is that clear?
I had a question.
Sure.
The new report that came out, I was just kind of curious if maybe, or I don't know if you were part of that, who played a pivotal role in that team, but I was curious like the kind of people behind that report, like what that kind of looks like when an OCLC releases a new report like that, who's involved, and kind of the scope of it, and what goes into something like that.
In this case, it was a collection of us in OCLC Research that had an interest in gaining a better understanding of the scholarly record because of other work that we were doing. So we might be working on different aspects of the scholarly record, research identifiers, shared print, various other things. But the sort of common denominator was the fact that the scholarly record was evolving, it was changing, and we needed to have a better understanding of what those changes were. So we sort of got together, pooled our knowledge, or in most cases our ignorance, and tried to come up with a conceptualization of what was happening that we could use, that we could point to in regard to our own work, but then that would be useful to others as well who were grappling with these issues. We found that not just in regard to scholarly record, but in many other areas as well, having some sort of general framework has been a useful tool to support discussions, because it gives you, it's just sort of some common ground that everyone can start from, and you can sort of establish common understandings, common terminology, the broad contours of the space that you're trying to understand, and then move discussions forward from there. I think an example of that in another area is, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Open Archival Information Systems Reference Model, OAIS. This was a reference model that very, just as we did here, in very high-level conceptual terms, tried to describe what was happening with digital preservation systems, what you would need to have a robust digital preservation system. And it was something that put together just a general framework and some general concepts, and from that, it really helped move forward various conversations across domains with very different stakeholders who had an interest in that topic. And we've seen the same sort of thing happen with this work. So there was sort of an internal purpose to producing this work and supporting our own research interests, but also the broader community interest that we were trying to demonstrate. Yes.
So I thought something very interesting, especially the roles. And I was wondering, you talked about a lot of competition in the space with big shared public sector. And as we try to define ourselves as libraries, as librarians, can you speak a little more about what are maybe some roles or responsibilities we should definitely hold on to and stake out versus ones that we might let go that others might be doing better?
Yeah, that's really the key question. And I'm not sure I have a definitive answer. I would start by saying I wouldn't use competition as sort of the metaphor there, because I don't think libraries should feel that they have to compete with these services. I think libraries should think about how they can complement those services, or how those services complement the core activities of the library. I think actually one of the worst things libraries can do is to try to reproduce some of the infrastructure and services that are springing up in other areas, because for a variety of reasons, economies of scope, economies of scale, various reasons, it would be hard for the library to duplicate that success. In terms of areas where libraries might have a special role to play, I think libraries have first and foremost, an advantage because they're the closest, in some respects, to the actual researchers at their institutions. And libraries are starting to sort of find ways to touch the research cycle far more, in more places than they used to in the past. So it's not a question of just providing scholarly materials, providing access to the scholarly record, but it's supporting the entire research cycle from start to finish in various ways. And you can think of the variety of services at your own library that fall into that. Copyright support, consultation for digital or data curation, help with creating data management plans, customized solutions for particular departmental needs in regard to gathering and curating certain scholarly outputs. So I think first and foremost, the library has the advantage of being the closest to their own researchers and understanding their needs and how the library can meet those needs. In the broader sense, I think libraries have a trust factor as well. People trust libraries. So in terms of issues like selection, appraisal, determining, authoritative or reliable sources for scholarly materials of various kinds. I think the library is viewed as an honest broker in that regard, and I think that is something that should be leveraged. And let's also not lose sight of the fact that libraries still have collections and will continue to have collections, and they do that very well. I think the nature of those collections are going to change. I think that libraries are going to be, they are less interested in collecting what you might call the commodity materials that everybody else collects, and they're more interested in building, in many ways, special collections that represent unique institutional assets. But the interesting issue there is that we build these sort of unique institutional assets, these unique collections. They're not just for local students, local faculty. They're for everybody, and that changes the incentive pattern for creating those collections. I mean, in the Printcentric day, you created your local collections because you served your local faculty and students. Now you're building collections to serve the wider scholarly community, and you have to make the case to administrators that that's a good investment of resources, that it contributes to the university's, global reputation. It makes it a more attractive destination for scholars, or some such argument as that. But the libraries will still have an important role to play in that ecosystem, building well-curated, unique collections as well. But your question is spot on. I mean, that finding the library's role in that ecosystem, finding the core areas of expertise where libraries are indispensable, and perhaps jettisoning some of the other activities that can be done elsewhere by others. I mean, that's really the key question in the libraries. Think about how they're going to recalibrate themselves.
And as you mentioned in your publication, those special collections can be part of that branding of how a global community looks at particular libraries. And you pointed that out at the beginning of your presentation. We can use this as a stepping point, a step-off point for a better branding of what we are doing to contribute to the global community. And that gives us the value, not only on our, for our institution, but beyond.
Right.
Would you say?
I think that's true, and I think that manifests itself on multiple scales. So you can think about sort of the broadest scale of, look, we have these resources that we've collected. Nobody else has them. This is a unique institutional asset, and scholars all over the world recognize it as such, and that's very good. You can also think about it at smaller scales. Think about working within a particular consortium, like say in Maryland CIC, for example. We have the best collection of fill in the blank in the CIC, and whereas we rely on Illinois because they have the best collection of something else, and there's sort of this coordinated collection development which occurs within that consortial scale of cooperation. Now, certainly that kind of thing already goes on. There's cooperative collection development activities that have been with us for quite some time. I think we're going to see more and more of that. Now, the question of what scale that should be implemented at, whether it should be done at a consortial scale, a regional scale, a national scale, or a global scale, that's a question that remains to be answered. But yeah, I think the common denominator is creating a distinctiveness within some sort of cooperative arrangement, whatever scale that cooperative arrangement manifests at. Yes? Well, I mean, I guess I would agree with that in principle, but you always run into economics. I mean, it would be great if everyone had their own contemporary composer's web archive, and we have this multitude of perspectives, but we simply don't have the resources for that. So I think that a lot of institutions would say, oh, well, Columbia's doing that, I don't have to. I can point my scholars over there. I don't have to go out and try to do that web archiving myself. I mean, I think that it is interesting because as you have more specialization in collection building, it takes some of the protective duplication out of the system, right? So in the old days, where the Printcentric scholarly record, everyone was collecting a lot of the same materials, you had this sort of layer of protection in the sense that we collect it, they're collecting it, and someone else is collecting it. So we have the assurance that we have many copies of it, and that will help us be confident that it will survive over the long term through sheer duplication. With the kind of specialization that we're talking about here, we remove some of that because as we specialize more and more, you don't have those points of duplication in the stewardship system. Now it's like, well, that stuff is here, and it's nowhere else. And that, raises important issues about commitments. So if the Contemporary Composers Web Archive is considered a vital scholarly resource, are we confident that Columbia has organized that archive in such a way that it will be sustained over the long term? And the same for other kinds of specialized collecting activities. So I think that's one of the things we need to think about. There are advantages in terms of efficiencies, economies of scale in specialization, but from a long-term stewardship perspective, there could be a situation where there's a single point of failure, essentially, and we have to think about that.
About out of time, but I would like for all of you to join me once again in thanking Brian for